Hey everybody, here we are again with a Unit 4 review, this time looking at changes in rural land use over time. As you can see, we have this beautiful representation of an aerial view of rural land use, right? Some of you may have seen this flying over the skies in aeroplanes, as it were, and seen these strange markings, right? Not left by aliens, but by humans, by people, by those like you and I. We're going to talk a little bit about these patterns and these changes in land use from when agriculture first started to trends that we see today. Let's get started. Now, it all starts with the Neolithic Revolution, also known as the first agricultural revolution. This is that first step, this transition into settled agriculture, right? You know that before we started farming, we had hunting and gathering as the primary way to procure food and resources. Pretty even splits between workloads. That's not to say we didn't have any sort of gender disparity, where we're not thinking of gender disparity in this case as being gender inequality, but as being just a difference between roles assigned to the traditional genders we think of between males and females. Back then, we'd be thinking things more in strictly terms of sex, male and female sexes of the species, in this case of the human species. So we have these hunting and gathering tribes who are mostly nomadic, traveling from place to place, because food is traveling from place to place too. At least the food that gets you the most bang for your buck, right? Meats and from animals and things. So we had the male groupings of these tribes who would normally do the hunting, the females who would normally do the gathering, and it was a very equal share in that sense, right? Because you never knew when you were going to get food to hunt or whether a hunt would be successful, so it was very important to have gathering done. Now, as these tribes developed, we end up with this transitionary period where these formerly nomadic hunter-gatherers are now transforming into settled agriculturalists, or early agriculturists at the very least. Now, this all leads to a number of effects, some of which includes and is preempted by the invention of tools, mastery over fire, the birth of language, the first urban revolutions too, because as we start settling into agriculture, people start congregating together in the same or similar places, that eventually leading to the first urban centers or city-states. So a lot of these events happen preempting each other, or at the very least happening as subsequent effects of each other. Now, some of the effects that we see is development agriculture in the first place, but also the domestication of animals and of food supplies, right? We see this happen simultaneously. And as you have more common food sources available, it's easier for you to forget the hunting-gathering ways to settle into one particular spot. We also talked about how this coincided with that language revolution, or that birth of Indo-European languages out of Mesopotamia, right out of southwestern Asia and western Asia. Now, this, of course, preempted the first urban revolution. People started conglomerating in the same spaces to farm, and as a result, you would develop into urban spaces. And the river valley civilizations are the ones that we think of most here. Indus River Valley, Nile River Valley, the Yangtze, Yellow River Valley, so on and so forth. Now, although we did develop food surpluses, although we did develop settled agriculture, there are some other effects to keep in mind. One was malnutrition, right? So even though hunting and gathering wasn't as consistent of a food source, it at least had a variety of food procured, which means fruits and veggies, which are very different than the ones we see nowadays, right? Than the domesticated versions, even after it was domesticated back then, and to the modern modified versions we can find now. But there was at least a variety of food, from meats, fish, veggies, because you're looking to eat whatever you can. Once agriculture developed, a lot of it was monoculture, right? Growing a one particular agricultural product and subsisting off that single product. Naturally, that's not the healthiest way to go about things, and we did see a drop in health and nutrition as a result. We can look at that in terms of skeletal structures of ancient humans, right? We can see over time after this revolution occurred, lower bone densities, smaller frames, things like that. Secondary, as we had this generally equal distribution of tasks in hunter-gatherer societies, we see a shift from matriarchal to patriarchal societies as agriculture develops, right? Men still going out to hunt and gather, and now, or males still going out to hunt and gather, and now seeing female members of these groups staying to manage the farms and the crops. And we've seen that trend follow to today, right? Especially in developing countries, we see more often than not women being involved in agriculture production, more so than men, or at least producing more of the food that's used more so than men in developing countries. Now, we have to fast forward a lot of time. And before we get to the next revolution, we actually have these transitionary periods, namely this Columbian Exchange that we see, right? So we end up with this diffusion of goods from the colonial groups that are moving now into the Western Hemisphere, or to the further west in the Western Hemisphere, and then bringing back different crops and animal products, and then transporting other crops and animal products and disease like smallpox, malaria, diphtheria, influenza, typhus, measles, and cough that eventually kill lots of people. But I digress. And we see this transition, this trading, right, of these agricultural goods. So when we think of the products we see today, as we'll look at in a few slides here, you have to keep in mind that these products, many of them that we know now, were not common to the places in which they are now associated, right? If we look here, we see things like potatoes and, right, Irish potato famine. That's the thing we looked at in the previous videos for Unit 3, but they actually weren't from Ireland, right? Potatoes are indigenous to South America, right, around Peru and those mountain ranges, right, those areas. Now, as this happened, we get these trade-offs and this trade and diffusion, right, to use the AP Human Geo term, of goods, and we actually see that play out later on. But this is one of these steps in between the revolutions, right? We're still, for the most part, doing basic merits of farming, or performing the basic merits of farming, settling into one place, growing single crops, maybe multiple crops, now that we have better understanding of land use and development, but no major or significant changes, right? It took a long time to fundamentally change the way farming worked. Now that leads us to our second agricultural revolution. Now, our first agricultural revolution, this Neolithic one, this is 8,000 BCE, right? That's when we, roughly 10,000 years ago, begin settled agriculture, and it doesn't change that much for the next 8,000-ish years, right, until we get into the 1700s. Now, here we start to develop, as you might guess, new machinery and things, and this coincides with the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 18th century, the late 1700s in Great Britain and in England, where we see these developments occur, because that's where the Industrial Revolution began, right? It's hard for the world. And so we see this co-development of new technologies to be used for economic outputs and development, and at the same time, technologies developed to be used for agricultural products. And these kind of go back and forth in terms of their influence. Now, we introduce these basic machines, like we can see here with the plow, right, that we can attach to a horse. And we see this transition now, this fundamental change in agriculture, where beforehand we're looking at completely manual labor, and we're looking at development of agriculture as it had been for the last thousands of years. And now we're fundamentally changing the way that agriculture works. We're shifting the workload to use more machinery, to use more animals in the production of products, the production of agricultural products. Things like the plow, like the mechanical reaper and the cotton gin, which all are meant to expedite the process of growing crops and producing agricultural goods, so that we can, bar none, increase yield. The Neolithic Revolution was no different in that sense. Yes, it's the start of agriculture. Yes, we shift from hunting and gathering to settled farming. But the big point, right, why we did it in the first place, why human beings as they were took out that nutrition, the nutritional value of hunting and gathering and settled into agriculture, was because of the yields that it produced. Simply producing more food, allowing more people to consume the food that's produced and available, and overall growing populations, right? Population migration stuff that you have there. This second agricultural revolution looked to the same end. How do we keep increasing yields to maintain and support carrying capacity, ding, big word, in order to support the populations in these locations? Now it takes another 100 or so years, 200-ish years rather, for the next developments to occur, for the next fundamental change to occur, and that's where we get our green revolution, our third agricultural revolution. Now this is an image that we've seen in those in class. We looked at this in our previous notes, where we have a number of people on a piece of land, and here they're spraying pesticides, herbicides, into these crops, right? And that's part and parcel with the Green Revolution. It's the 1960s and 1980s, and we're looking at the development, of GMOs, high-yield seeds, and fertilizers from MDCs to LDCs. So this Green Revolution starts in more developed countries, and we see the diffusion of these products and goods to less developed and developing countries over time within this 20-year span. Nowadays, and we'll look at it in a sec, it's kind of shaped the way that the global agricultural, the interdependence of global agriculture has developed, as it were. But here we're just focused on the basics, right, before we get into all that other stuff. I am sorry. So we have this diffusion of GMOs, high-yield seeds, and fertilizers, and the whole point is the same as the revolutions before it, to increase the yield of agricultural practices in order to keep supporting and improving upon carrying capacity so that we can keep supporting human populations, right? Second agricultural revolution, we're barely hitting 1 billion people in the world in 1800. By the time the Green Revolution comes around, we have a good 5 to 6 billion people on the earth, and we're still growing, right? That'll cap out, right? That's demographic momentum stuff, right? The age of peak child and all that, where we're going to hit about 10 billion-ish people, and then we'll level off. We won't grow anymore from there, based on projected measures. But it's still about increasing the yield for the people that we have now, right? Developing these different technologies in order to increase and improve upon that yield. Now, we saw a lot of good developments out of this, a lot of positive effects, we might say. So here we have a map of, a chart rather, of India's crop yields over time, for rice, for wheat, and for pulses. We're really concerned with rice and wheat in this case. We're looking at the changes from the 1950s to the 2000s, to the 1990s, really to the end, right to the beginning of the 21st century. Now we can see again, and recall, the third agricultural revolution makes its debut in the 1960s through the 80s, and that's when we see the diffusion of these goods to less developed developing countries, India being one of these now developing countries, and NIC as we would call it now. So we see these crop yields, and they are developing, 660, 663, and this is yield per hectare in kilograms, so it's 668 kilograms, 668,000 grams, right, per hectare, which is the unit we use to measure agricultural spaces. And we can see very soon increases in agricultural yield starting in the 60s, in the beginning, from 1960 to 1961. As time passes, for these two particular products, not so much for pulses, we see rapid and significant development, right? What we call significant here would mean a greater number than expected, or a greater number than would normally be expected without any outside influence. In this case, we know there's an influence, it's the Green Revolution. So we see these triple, really, right, from 668 to 1986, more than triple it seems, to reach these peaks of 1,986 kilograms per hectare, where it was just 668 kilograms per hectare in the 1950s, before this Green Revolution occurred. So we can see areas like India who benefited greatly, and other areas too in Latin America and South America, Central America as well, that really benefited from these new technologies, from GMOs, high-yield seeds, and fertilizers. We're looking at different effects thereafter, which is another video, but this is one of the positive effects that we see, right? A true increase in crop yield, especially for rice and wheat, which would be staple crops, right? Crops that are food products that are consumed by people to subsist on, right? Crops that are usually used as a main food source, a main part of diets. Now we can see these trends shift from the MDCs and LDCs and everywhere in between, right? So if we look at these developing countries like India, and we can see their agricultural yields increasing, we see a different kind of trend in MDCs like the United States, where we look at that time period, right, after 1950 to 1960, and we start to see these opposite trends, where we're not increasing the amount of agricultural production in the sense of increasing farms or farmland. What's actually happening, and what we started to see, right, if we look at this map, we can see on one end we have the number of farms in millions, and then we have the average size of farms in acres. All right, so we're looking at two different ends of this map and looking to get the conclusions therein. So the trend that we start to see is that over time in the United States, from 1900 to 2007, the average size of farms increases dramatically. Right, and we're going here from just under 200 acres per farm to now a little over 400 acres per farm, right? Almost a doubling of farm size. Now, you may think, wow, they're really increasing the size of the farms. There's so much food that's being produced now. We have so many more farmers that are in practice, so many more farms opening up, but that's not actually the case, right? Despite the new green revolution technologies, which in other areas increase the amount of farmland that could be used and developed because it helped crops grow faster and more and produce more products. In the US, we see the opposite trend happening. Because we can produce so much more using these high yield seeds, fertilizers, and GMOs, we don't actually need as many farms to be producing products. So we see the number of farms themselves decrease, right? Going from about 6 million farms to now 2 million farms, right? Almost what we'd see is near 66% decrease in total farms. But the farms that are left over are making up the difference by increasing their size, right? Who's able to have the most access to farmland to use these new technologies to produce the same or similar, or in many cases, more or greater amounts of food than before. So we don't really need these 6 million plus farms. We only have these about 2 million or so, but they're producing likely just as much, if not more, agricultural products than ever before. Now, all this said, there's an organization piece that takes place, right? And this all starts with this dude, my favorite dude of this course, von Thunen, right? Johann Heinrich von Thunen, as he's called. And look, you wish that someone looked at you like von Thunen looks at this model. Look, this model was spectacular. It's one of my favorite models in the course. Right? Despite the urban models, we're not going to get to cover in specific. We'll reference them a little bit. Winner of the German's top agricultural land use model of the 18th century. So this model tells us about rural land use, right? Especially it's specific to Germany at first, but it can be applied in other places. And this is about spatial organization, right? This is kind of what we're looking at here in this case, in this particular example, this particular model, is the spatial organization of rural land. And in this case, we're thinking about farmland, right? So von Thunen's model itself establishes this sort of pattern, right? Now we see the central city, which is what von Thunen noticed, all throughout the countryside in Germany. Cities, towns, urban centers were organized in pretty much the same way. They had the city or market at the center, surrounded by market gardening, dairying, or intensive types of farming, surrounded by another area of forest and natural resources, which was surrounded itself by extensive grain farming, and which was surrounded on its outskirts by ranching and livestock. Now, this well enough tells us the pattern of what's going on, right? It tells us how things are organized. And if we're looking to identify the model, identify stages of the model, identify the pattern in von Thunen's model, this is at least the starting point. But it's not all that we want to know, right? This is just the what of the model. What is located where? Well, in the center, there's a central market or city surrounded by market and dairying, closest to that market or city, and then furthest away from the market or city is ranching and livestock, extensive ranching and livestock farming, right? That's the starting point, but that's not enough. Right, we still want to be able to apply this model to understand not just what the model says, what the model tells us, but why the model is the way it is. And that's the whole point of models in the first place. They're supposed to represent some trend or feature phenomenon going on in the world. And part of that is understanding what the phenomenon is, right? How land is organized around a central city. But another part of that is why that's the case, why the world is the way it is for this particular topic. And in this case, we want to know why the pattern is the way it is for rural land use, as von Thunen saw it in Germany. Now, to get an understanding of where this comes from, why the model looks the way it does, we have to look at a bit of economic geography. Okay? And we're looking at what we call the bid rent or land rent curve. And this was really, this underlies some of the patterns that we see in von Thunen's model and some other patterns that we see in other models too, right, in terms of urban geography and land use in general. The general idea here is that the farther we move from a city, the farther away we get from a city center, or market, the less expensive land becomes. The closer we get to that city center or market, the more expensive land becomes. So the question becomes one of cost, right? Where is the cheapest land? Where is the most expensive land? Yeah, the cheapest land is going to be farthest away from the city. The most expensive land is going to be furthest in. And we're thinking of this per unit, right? We can think of it per acre if that makes it simpler. Right? It's going to cost maybe $50 per acre. It's really cheap. It's not going to be that cheap. But for our example, it could be $50 per acre in the center of the city and be $10 per acre farther away from the city. So part of this bid rent curve plays into von Thunen's model because naturally when you're performing any type of agriculture, you're going to have to be involved in land use, right? You're using the land in some way. You're going to need some amount of land to practice your agriculture. And for von Thunen, and for agriculture in general, that means taking into account the types of farming we're looking at. Not so much subsistence commercial, rather intensive and extensive farming, because that depends upon the amount of labor and work that goes in, the capital that goes into the practice, but also on the amount of land, the extent of land that is used. So with extensive farming, we have these larger plots of land that are being used and relatively little work. But the fact that we need these larger areas means we don't want to pay as much for them, right? We need a lot more land. But if you're paying too much for the land that you use, you're maybe not going to make a profit. So naturally, those extensive types of practices happen farther away from a city center, happen farther away from that market area. Just because you need more land, the land is cheaper farther away from the city, so it makes sense to go where the cheapest land is available. For intensive practices, we're not using as much land. These are usually more compact spaces. We can fit the types of farming and have greater yields per acre, per unit of land compared to extensive farming. So we can work with smaller plots. Now, because of that, we can buy land that is closer to the market, closer to the city center, because we're not using as much land as an extensive practice. And we can produce enough to make a profit per units of land that we buy compared to the extensive farming, who needs more land to do the same. Now, other considerations for von Thunen, at least, because again, this is 18th century stuff, is looking at perishability of products, right? So for the most part, extensive grains, extensive ranching, we don't have to worry too much about perishability. For the grains, because things like wheat have a long shelf life, they don't spoil very easily or very quickly. And then we have things like beef or pork or whatever else we're using, sheep and whatever else you might be using for ranching, rather, which won't start to spoil until they're butchered, right? And the animals themselves can walk to the markets on their own, or they're going to start spoiling before they reach the market or until they are processed, right? Other products, especially in market gardening and dairying in the 18th century, have a short shelf life. Even today, we have relatively short shelf lives compared to what we know, right, about keeping things fresh and about keeping products fresh. So if we're thinking of things like strawberries and blueberries, dairy products like milk or butter or cheese, it's going to be a lot more difficult to maintain those products at their freshness if you are farther away from a market center. You want to be close to the market so you can sell those products quickly and then make your way elsewhere. Now, the model itself, if we think contemporaneously, with other agricultural changes that have happened in the last 20, 30 years, doesn't quite apply as much because of those changes, right? Yes, we're still concerned about land use. Yes, we still have this application of the bid rent curve, the expensive land compared to distance to the city center, but things like perishability of products and transportation cost aren't going to be as much of a consideration anymore. Now here we can look at the U.S. We can assume that, let's say, New York City is a city center, is our market. Surrounding it, we can have some intensive practices like maple syrup production, grape farming, which is we call it grape farming, vineyards, right, for intensive practices, and that seems to make sense. We have this located around the city center like it should be. Surrounding that should be forests and natural resources, which we don't really have here, right, as major practices. Surrounding there, we have should have extensive farming, extensive grains. We have corn, we have wheat, which makes sense. Ranching on the outer edges, which we don't have quite in a fifth ring type of state. But if we're at least following the order, we can see intensive agriculture extensive grains, extensive ranching, but we have these other pop-ups, right, that are kind of out of place. We have this intensive farming that's outside of that first ring, cherries too here in Michigan. Our Michigan cherries are very good, by the way. If you have a chance to try them, you should. And then we have other intensive products like artichokes and avocados, right? The grapes again here in California. And that's going to do with our agricultural production regions, the transfer and transference of agricultural products to new climates that are similar to the ones in which they first appeared. And with that, along with increases in technology like refrigeration and freezer technology, we can keep products and goods relatively far from any markets where they'd be sold or where they'd be acquired by consumers, because we're able now to extend that shelf life, right? To extend the time frame in which an item becomes spoiled or rots. Right? So there are some applications here for von Thunen where historically it made sense, and it still makes sense today in regard to land cost, right? Which is intensive versus extensive farming land cost. But in other cases with new technology like transportation, refrigeration, it doesn't quite fit the bill in a lot of cases anymore because that doesn't fit the model and because the technologies just weren't around back then. Now overall, we have these factors that play into rural land use, the first and foremost of which is always going to be climatic and soil conditions, right? If you're in the wrong climate or in an area that doesn't have arable land, good soil, it's going to be very difficult to produce agricultural products. And that's going to shift what kind of agricultural product you produce, right? We're thinking back to the first video with the basics, or the first review video with the basics, where we're looking at Mediterranean agriculture versus pastoral nomadism, right? You shift your practice to fit your climatic conditions. Determinism, possibilism, thing to think about. Aside from that, we're looking at cost of transportation and of land use, right? You want to minimize your cost as much as possible. It's the same for industrial production. You want to make sure that you're not paying so much that you're not going to make a profit, and that you are producing enough or producing a product that is lucrative enough to make you or to earn a profit for your business or for your farm. Historically, we looked at perishability of products, which nowadays is kind of up in the air. There may be some specialty products that still need to be relatively close to market, so they're being sold locally. But in terms of global production, we have a lot of change that's happened technologically with transportation and refrigeration technology, and specific for food products, that's extended this perishability window, and that makes it almost, that makes distance almost irrelevant. Next time, we'll take a look at this globalization of agriculture, and this is just a picture to give you a preview of that if you're watching the videos in order. If you're watching one right now, you're going to watch the next on Wednesday or something like that. Although you need to watch them all for your quiz, right? And here we see that nowadays, where we started agriculture in different parts of the world, one of them being Mesopotamia, right, Southwest Asia, we've now seen an increase of agricultural production such that the world is global, right? We're not going to have any state, right, preview of Unit 5, that is completely dependent upon foreign crops, but we definitely see countries now that are using, more often than not, foreign commodities or foreign luxury goods. And that's a result of what we call the globalization of agriculture, and, hey, that's the title for the next one. So I hope this review is helpful to you. Hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe, and we'll see you on the next one.